SpringBoot 3.1.0 is released, and a major feature in this release is test container support. In this release, SpringBoot introduced the concept of service connections that simplifies writing tests using test containers. Not only that, this release also added support for using test containers for local development as well. Let's say you are building an application using Postgres database. We know that we can use test containers for testing, but what if you want to run the application locally? You need to have a Postgres database running in order to run the application. With the new test containers local development support, you can configure the required application dependencies like databases, Kafka, RabbitMQ, etc. And when you run the application, these dependent services will be started automatically using test containers behind the scenes, and your application will be automatically configured to use those services as well. Let's see it in action. Let us build a simple REST API using Spring Data JPA, Flyway database migrations, and Postgres database, and then see how test containers is going to help us for building this application. So let's go to start.spring.io and then select the starters: Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, Flyway migration, PostgreSQL JDBC driver, and test containers. Now you can generate the application. I have imported the generated project into my IntelliJ IDEA and also implemented basic Spring Boot REST API using Spring Data JPA. So here is the customer JPA entity with a couple of properties ID and name, and we have customer repository which extends JPA repository, and then we have customer controller with a single API endpoint to fetch all the customers. And also we have created this Flyway database migration script to create the customers table, and also we inserted a few records into our customers table. And here is an integration test for testing our API endpoint. Prior to Spring Boot 3.1.0, this is how we used to write an integration test using test containers. Here we are using test containers JUnit 5 extension annotations at test containers and at container to spin up a Postgres database container, and then we have registered Spring Boot data source properties using at dynamic property source mechanism, and then finally we have written a test that will invoke /API/customers API endpoint, and then we are asserting the status code to be 200, and the body of the response should contain 3 objects, customer objects in the response, because in our Flyway migrations we have inserted 3 records into our customers table. Okay, so let us run this test and then see. So it is going to invoke the API endpoint and then assert the status code and the body. So the test is passed. Spring Boot 3.1.0 introduced the concept of service connection to simplify this configuration here. Instead of explicitly registering the data source properties using dynamic property source mechanism, we can simply annotate with add service connection, and then we can remove this dynamic property source registration here, and if we run the test, it should work just like before. So the test is passed. If you go to Spring Boot's official documentation, under Service Connections section, you can see the list of containers that are supported by service connections. So you can see the JDBC databases like Postgres database, MySQL, MariaDB, etc. are supported, and also NoSQL databases like MongoDB, Cassandra, Couchbase, Elasticsearch, they are all supported, and also messaging brokers like Kafka, RabbitMQ, they are also supported. So most of the services that we use typically in our applications are already supported using service connections concept. Also, if you are using any other containers that are not yet having service connection support from Spring Boot, you can still spin up that container and then use dynamic property source mechanism to register the properties. So far, we have seen how to use test containers for writing tests using service connection support. Now let us explore how to use test containers for local development as well. If you go to Spring Boot's official documentation, here we can see how to use test containers during the development time. So Here we can create a configuration class which is annotated with @testConfiguration, and then we can register the required containers as a bean and also annotated with @ServiceConnection. Then we can create a class with a main method under src test java, and then we can register that configuration class so that when you run this class with a main method, it will start the application along with this container configuration, so that whatever the containers that you registered as a beans, it will automatically start those containers and then register the properties with the Spring application context and then starts your application. So let us try it out. So here I have created a test configuration class under src test java, and I have defined PostgreSQL container as a bean and also annotated with @ServiceConnection. Then I have created another class called test application under src test java, and I have created a main method, and I have used Spring application from, and here observe that we are not using this test application but the demo application which is under src main java, the main entry point class for our application, and we are referring the main method, and also we are registering this test containers config test configuration class and then starting our application. So now let us start the application here using this test application, and here we can see it will automatically start the Postgres container using test containers, and then it will start the application. Now if we go to browser and access our API endpoint, we can see the response here. So our application take care of starting the application dependencies using this configuration class, and using the test containers behind the scenes, it will automatically spin up whatever the required containers and then register the properties with our application context and starts your application. So this way it will become much more easy to just clone a repository and then just start running your application without having to install anything explicitly. Not only from our IDE, we can also start our application from terminal using our build tool. If we are using maven, we can use maven SpringBoot test run to start the application using test application inside our src test java. If you run spring-boot run, it will start the application using the main entry point class demo application. Similarly, if you are using Gradle, you can use Gradle boot run, which will start the application using demo application. Whereas if you want to run the application using test application, you can run Gradle boot test run goal, which will start the application using this test application, which is there inside src test java. So let us go to terminal and run this goal to run our application using test application. So the application successfully started. Let us open the browser and then invoke our API endpoint to see the response. So here I am invoking the API endpoint, and here we can see the response. During the application development, you keep changing the application logic and then you restart, then the current running containers will be destroyed and then recreated. This may slow down the application development workflow. So what we can do, we can add SpringBoot DevTools dependency here, and then we can go to our test containers configuration class and then add restart scope for our containers. So whenever you change your application classes and then you rebuild the project, instead of destroying and then recreating the containers, it will reuse the containers and then only reload the application code changes only. So this will help to speed up the development process. We have seen how SpringBoot test container support helps not only for writing tests, but also for running the application locally. If you prefer to read and follow along, you can go to AtomicJar.com and go to blog, and here you can read and follow along this SpringBoot application testing and development with test containers blog post, and then you can learn more about the features introduced in SpringBoot 3.10.